The blood on Genevieve Norwood's hands was still warm when she decided she would never kill another living thing again. Though by dawn the next morning, she would be setting wire snares along the creek bed behind the ramshackle cabin where Harold and Martha Patterson lived. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the Texas sky in shades of amber and rose when Genevieve crept through the tall grass, her worn boots leaving trails in the dew. Trinity, Texas in 1878 was barely more than a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the vastness of the prairie, and kindness was a currency more valuable than gold. The elderly couple next door had fed her when she first arrived 6 months ago, a frightened 20-year-old widow with nothing but the dress on her back and a wedding ring she had sold within the first week. Now it was her turn to provide, even if her methods were unorthodox, and her skills were still being learned through painful trial and error. The snares were simple things, fashioned from wire she had traded for by mending clothes at the general store. Genevieve had watched her father set them years ago in Missouri, before the fever took him and her mother in the same bitter winter. The memory of his calloused hands guiding hers felt both close and impossibly distant as she positioned the loops near the rabbit runs she had been observing for weeks. Harold Patterson's cough had worsened with the changing seasons, and Martha's hands shook too much now to do the fine sewing work that had once brought them a modest income. The town had no doctor, and the nearest one was 2 days' ride away in a direction Genevieve could not afford to travel. She worked quickly, her fingers nimble despite the cold that made them ache. 3 snares along the creek, 2 more near the mesquite thicket where she had seen cottontails darting at dusk. It was not much, but it was something. Genevieve had learned that something was always better than nothing when hunger made your stomach feel like it was eating itself from the inside out. The wire caught the early light as she secured the last one, and she whispered a small prayer that her efforts would not be in vain. The Pattersons needed protein, needed something more substantial than the thin vegetable soup they had been living on since Harold's fall from the ladder had left him unable to work. By the time she returned to her own cabin, a one-room affair that leaned slightly to the left and let in the wind through gaps in the walls, the sun had fully risen. Genevieve built up the fire in her small stove and put on water for coffee, though she was stretching the ground so thin now that the resulting brew was more the memory of coffee than the actual thing. She had been a schoolteacher back in Missouri, married at 19 to a man who promised her the world and delivered 6 months of marriage before a horse kicked him in the chest and left her alone in a strange town with debts she could not pay. Trinity had seemed like a place to disappear, to start over, but starting over required resources she simply did not have. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up from the window. A rider was coming down the main road, and even from a distance, Genevieve could see he sat his horse like a man born to the saddle. Trinity did not get many visitors, and those it did get were usually passing through on their way to somewhere else, somewhere that mattered more than this forgotten cluster of buildings on the edge of nowhere. She watched as he slowed near the livery stable, dismounting with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. He was tall, that much was clear even from her window, and he wore the dust of long travel like a second skin. Genevieve turned away, dismissing the stranger from her thoughts. She had learned the hard way that strangers brought complications, and she had enough of those already. Instead, she focused on the tasks of her day, mending a shirt for the blacksmith's wife, checking the garden patch behind her cabin where a few stubborn vegetables clung to life despite her inexpert care, and later, when the sun began its descent, checking her snares. The hours passed with the slow inevitability of all days in Trinity, marked by the sound of hammers from the blacksmith's forge and the occasional bark of a dog. When she returned to the creek at dusk, her heart sank. The snares were empty, every single one of them. Either she had placed them poorly, or the rabbits had grown wise to such tricks. Genevieve reset them with fingers that trembled slightly, though whether from cold or frustration she could not say. On her way back, she stopped at the Patterson cabin, a structure that was only marginally more sound than her own. Martha answered her knock, her weathered face breaking into a smile that made the disappointment of the empty snares a little easier to bear. "Genevieve, child, come in out of the cold," Martha said, though the interior of the cabin was scarcely warmer than the outside. Harold sat in a chair near the fire, a blanket wrapped around his thin shoulders. His cough had a wet, rattling quality that made Genevieve's chest tighten with worry. "I just wanted to check on you both," Genevieve said, settling onto a stool near the fire. "How is the cough, Harold?" The old man waved a dismissive hand, but the gesture turned into another coughing fit that left him gasping. Martha's face creased with worry as she moved to her husband's side, rubbing his back until the spasm passed. Genevieve felt helpless in the face of their suffering, inadequate in every way that mattered. What good were wire snares and good intentions when what they needed was medicine and food and a warm place to recover? "We will manage," Martha said firmly, though her eyes told a different story. "The Lord provides." Genevieve wished she had Martha's faith. Her own had been tested and found wanting in the month since Thomas died, leaving her with a bitterness she tried to keep hidden. But she smiled and nodded, making small talk about the weather and the town gossip, until the darkness outside made it clear she should return to her own cabin. She promised to check on them in the morning, a promise she intended to keep even if her snares remained empty. The next morning dawned cold and clear, and Genevieve was up before the sun, pulling on her shawl and heading to the creek with hope warring against expectation in her chest. The first snare was empty. So was the second. But the third held a rabbit, a good-sized one, and Genevieve felt a surge of triumph so strong it almost brought tears to her eyes. She reset the snare and continued her rounds, finding one more rabbit near the mesquite thicket. 2 rabbits. It was not a feast, but it was enough to make a difference. She was heading back toward her cabin, the rabbits hanging from her belt, when she nearly collided with the stranger she had seen riding into town the day before. Up close, he was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore a gun on his hip with the casual ease of someone who knew how to use it, and there was a hardness to his face that spoke of a difficult life lived on difficult terms. "Pardon me, miss," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep and carried the soft drawl of someone from further south, maybe Louisiana or the eastern parts of Texas. "I did not mean to startle you." "You did not," Genevieve said, though her heart was beating faster than it had been a moment before. She was acutely aware of the rabbits at her belt, of the wire still visible on the smaller one where she had not yet removed the snare. "I should have been watching where I was going." His eyes dropped to the rabbits, and something flickered across his face too quickly for her to read. "Good hunting," he said. "Necessary hunting," Genevieve corrected without thinking, then wondered why she felt the need to explain herself to this stranger. "The couple next door, they are elderly and unable to hunt for themselves. I set snares to help provide for them." The man's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. "That is kind of you. Not many people look out for their neighbors these days." Genevieve shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "They looked out for me when I first arrived. I am just returning the favor." She made to move past him, but he stepped slightly to the side, not blocking her path but clearly wanting to continue the conversation. "I am Xander Sullivan," he said. "I just hired on at the ranch about 10 miles north of here. I will be in town fairly regular, picking up supplies and such." "Genevieve Norwood," she replied, because it would have been rude not to. "Welcome to Trinity, Mr. Sullivan. I hope you find it suits you." "Just Xander is fine," he said. "And I hope so too. I have been drifting for a while now. It would be nice to settle somewhere for a spell." There was something in his voice, a weariness that Genevieve recognized because she carried it herself. The weight of loss, of starting over, of trying to build something from nothing in a world that did not make it easy. But she pushed the feeling aside, offering him a polite smile before excusing herself to return to her cabin. She had rabbits to clean and neighbors to feed, and no time to stand in the road making conversation with handsome strangers, no matter how lonely she might be. The Pattersons were pathetically grateful for the meat, so much so that Genevieve had to blink back tears as she helped Martha prepare the rabbits for cooking. She stayed long enough to see them eating, to see color return to Harold's pale cheeks, before returning to her own cabin as the afternoon sun slanted through the gaps in the walls. She had done a good thing today, she told herself. It was enough. But when she checked her snares the next morning, they were all empty again, and the morning after that as well. Genevieve began to worry that her brief success had been a fluke, that the rabbits had learned to avoid her traps. She reset them each time with increasing frustration, adjusting the placement, trying different approaches, but the results remained the same. Empty snares and growing desperation. On the fourth morning, she found Xander Sullivan waiting near the creek, sitting on a fallen log with the easy patience of a man accustomed to waiting. He stood when he saw her approach, and Genevieve noticed for the first time the leather satchel at his feet. "Miss Norwood," he said, and there was something almost shy in the way he said it. "I hope you do not mind my being here. I have been watching you check your snares these past few mornings on my way into town, and I thought maybe I could help." Genevieve stiffened, pride warring with practicality. "I do not need charity, Mr. Sullivan." "Xander," he corrected gently. "And I am not offering charity. I am offering a trade. I am a fair hand at hunting, and the ranch where I work we have more deer than we know what to do with. I was thinking I could bring some venison for you and your neighbors, and in exchange, maybe you could teach me a bit about the town, introduce me around. I am new here, and it would help to have a friendly face vouch for me." It was a thin excuse, and they both knew it. But there was an earnestness in his eyes that made Genevieve hesitate. She thought of Harold's cough, of Martha's trembling hands, of her own growing hunger as she gave more and more of her meager resources to her neighbors. Pride was one thing, but survival was another. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. "You do not know me. You do not know them." Xander was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "My grandparents raised me after my parents died," he said finally. "They were old and worn down by hard living, but they did their best by me. When they passed, there was no one to help them, no one to ease their last days. I have always regretted that I could not do more for them. Maybe helping your neighbors is a way of making up for that, even if it is too late for my own." The honesty in his words hit Genevieve like a physical blow. She understood that kind of regret, the weight of things left undone, words left unsaid. She had felt it every day since Thomas died, since she realized how little she had truly known the man she married, how much of their brief time together had been built on hopes and assumptions rather than real understanding. "All right," she said quietly, "but I will not take charity. If you bring meat, I will cook it properly for all of us. You can join us for supper." A smile broke across Xander's face, transforming it from hard and closed to something warm and open. "That is more than fair, Miss Norwood. I will bring venison enough for all three of you and for yourself as well." "Genevieve," she corrected, mirroring his earlier words. "If we are to be trading favors, we might as well use first names." Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Genevieve would check her snares at dawn, sometimes finding rabbits, more often finding empty wire. Xander would appear every few days with fresh venison from his hunting trips, refusing to take anything more than a shared meal in payment. Genevieve would cook the meat at the Patterson cabin, where the fire was better, and there was room for all of them to sit together. The meals became a bright spot in the otherwise grinding monotony of survival, a few hours where laughter was possible, and the future seemed less bleak. Genevieve learned that Xander had been born in Louisiana, that he had lost his parents to yellow fever when he was 8, that he had spent the years since drifting from job to job, never quite finding a place that felt like home. He spoke little of his time during the war, but Genevieve gathered he had served, had seen things that left shadows in his eyes. He was good with his hands, skilled with horses and cattle, and he had a quiet gentleness that seemed at odds with the gun he always wore. Xander learned that Genevieve had been a teacher, that she had loved books and learning more than anything, until circumstances had forced her into a marriage that had promised security, but delivered only more uncertainty. She spoke of Thomas only once, admitting that she had barely known him before they wed, that his death had left her feeling more relieved than grief-stricken, and then guilty for feeling relieved at all. Xander had listened without judgment, his steady presence a comfort in itself. Harold's cough began to improve with regular meals of meat, and the soup Martha made from the bones. Color returned to both the old people's faces, and Martha's hands steadied enough that she could do simple sewing again. Genevieve felt a fierce satisfaction in their recovery, even as she became increasingly aware of Xander's presence in her life. The way her heart beat faster when she heard his horse approaching. The way she found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what he was doing, whether he was safe. It terrified her. She had sworn after Thomas died that she would never again put her happiness in the hands of another person, never again make herself vulnerable to that kind of loss. But Xander was different from Thomas in every way that mattered. Where Thomas had been full of grand promises and empty words, Xander was quiet and steady, his actions speaking louder than any declarations. Where Thomas had seen her as a convenience, a means to an end, Xander looked at her like she mattered, like her thoughts and feelings were worth his time and attention. One evening in late October, after they had eaten, and the Pattersons had retired to their bed in the corner of the cabin, Genevieve and Xander sat by the fire, the silence between them comfortable and easy. She was mending one of Harold's shirts, her needle moving in and out of the fabric with practiced efficiency, while Xander whittled at a piece of wood, shavings falling around his feet. "Can I ask you something?" Xander said finally, his voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping couple. "You just did," Genevieve replied, then smiled to take the sting from her words. "But yes, you can ask. Why did you stay in Trinity? After your husband died, I mean. You could have gone anywhere, done anything. Why here?" Genevieve set down her mending, considering the question. It was one she had asked herself many times in the dark hours of the night when sleep would not come and the wind howled through the gaps in her cabin walls. "I had debts to pay," she said finally. "Thomas left me with nothing but bills and obligations. By the time I settled them, I had no money to go anywhere else. And then the Pattersons took me in, helped me get on my feet, and it seemed wrong to just leave. This place, it is not much, but it is mine. I have built something here, even if it is small." Xander nodded slowly, his knife still moving over the wood. "I understand that. The need to build something that is yours, that nobody can take away. Is that why you took the ranch job? To build something?" "Partly," he admitted. "Mostly I was tired of drifting. Tired of waking up in strange places with no reason to be there. I wanted, I do not know, roots maybe, something to anchor me." He looked up from his whittling, meeting her eyes. "And then I met you, and suddenly Trinity seemed like exactly the right place to be." Genevieve's breath caught in her throat. The firelight cast dancing shadows across Xander's face, highlighting the planes and angles, the scar that ran along his jaw from some old injury he had never explained. She should say something, deflect the moment, protect herself from the dangerous pull of emotion, but the words would not come. "Genevieve," Xander said, setting aside his whittling and leaning forward. "I know it has not been long, I know you have reasons to be cautious. But I need you to know that what I feel for you, it is real. It is not about convenience or loneliness or any of the other things people convince themselves is love. You are the first thing I think about in the morning and the last thing on my mind at night. When I hunt, I am thinking about bringing meat to you and the Pattersons. When I am working, I am counting the hours until I can ride into town and see you again. I am not good with words, and I know I come with my own share of troubles and shadows, but if you would let me, I would like to court you properly. I would like to see where this could go." The speech was halting and awkward in places, but it was the most honest thing Genevieve had heard in longer than she could remember. She could feel tears gathering in her eyes, emotion rising up to choke her. She thought of all the reasons she should say no, should protect herself, should keep the walls high and strong. And then she thought of the alternative, of years stretching ahead in loneliness, of dying never having taken the risk of loving again. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I would like that." Xander's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his palm rough with calluses, warm and solid and real. They sat like that for a long time, hands linked, the fire crackling, the Pattersons snoring softly in their bed. It was not a grand gesture or a passionate declaration, but it felt right in a way that nothing in Genevieve's life had felt right in a very long time. The courtship that followed was necessarily slow, conducted in stolen moments and small gestures. Trinity was a small town, and gossip traveled faster than wildfire. Genevieve was aware of the talk, the speculation about the widow and the cowboy, but she found she did not care as much as she thought she would. Let them talk. She had done nothing wrong, and neither had Xander. They were two people trying to find happiness in a hard world, and there was no shame in that. Xander continued to bring venison every few days, sometimes joining them for supper, sometimes just dropping off the meat and tipping his hat before riding back to the ranch. But there were other moments too. A walk along the creek on Sunday afternoons after church, a shared cup of coffee at the general store when Genevieve was picking up supplies. The dance held at the church hall in November, where Xander held her close, and they swayed to music played on a battered fiddle and an out-of-tune piano. And Genevieve felt young and hopeful for the first time since before her parents died. Harold and Martha watched the developing romance with obvious approval, their eyes twinkling whenever Xander appeared. Martha took to inviting him to supper even on days when he did not bring meat, and Harold started asking his advice on repairs to the cabin and other matters. The old couple were clearly adopting him into their small family, and Xander seemed equally charmed by them. Genevieve would watch him listening patiently to Harold's rambling stories of his youth, or helping Martha with tasks her shaking hands made difficult, and feel her heart swell with something she was beginning to recognize as love. Winter came to Trinity with a vengeance that year, bringing cold that seeped into bones and made every day a test of endurance. Genevieve's cabin was barely adequate shelter, and there were mornings when she woke to find frost on the inside of the walls. Her snares yielded less and less as the rabbits grew scarce and wary, but Xander's hunting provided a steady supply of meat that kept all three of them fed. He also brought firewood, chopped and stacked it outside both cabins without being asked, his breath steaming in the cold air as he worked. One particularly bitter day in December, Genevieve woke to find her cabin nearly buried in snow. The storm had come in during the night, howling like a living thing, piling drifts against the walls until the door would barely open. She managed to force it wide enough to slip through, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and made her way to the Patterson cabin to check on them. The elderly couple were huddled by their fire, wrapped in every blanket they owned, but they were alive and relatively warm. "Xander will not be able to make it into town in this," Martha said, her voice tight with worry. "The roads will be impassable." She was right. 3 days passed with no sign of Xander, and Genevieve felt anxiety growing in her chest. Was he safe? Was he warm and fed at the ranch, or had he tried to make it to town and gotten caught in the storm? The questions circled endlessly in her mind, making sleep impossible and food tasteless. She checked her snares obsessively, but the snow had driven all the animals to ground. Their supply of meat dwindled rapidly, and Genevieve found herself rationing carefully, making sure the Pattersons ate while her own portions grew smaller. On the 4th day, when the storm finally broke and weak sunlight struggled through the clouds, Genevieve heard hoofbeats. She ran to the window, her heart in her throat, and saw Xander riding down the road, his horse laboring through snow that came up to its knees. He was leading a second horse, and both animals were loaded with supplies. Genevieve did not remember crossing the distance between her cabin and the road. One moment she was at the window, the next she was in the snow in her bare feet, throwing her arms around Xander as he dismounted. He caught her, his arms strong and sure, and for a moment they just stood there, holding each other while the horses snorted and stamped. "I was so worried," Genevieve said against his chest, her voice muffled by his coat. "I thought you might have tried to travel in the storm, that you might be hurt or frozen somewhere." "I am fine," Xander said, his hand stroking her hair. "The boss would not let anyone leave the ranch until the storm passed. I have been half out of my mind thinking about you and the Pattersons out here in this cold. I brought as much as the horses could carry. Food, firewood, extra blankets. I will not have you freezing or starving if I can help it." Genevieve pulled back enough to look up at his face. His nose and cheeks were red with cold, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, and he had never looked more beautiful to her. "I love you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I did not want to, I tried not to, but I do." "I love you, Xander Sullivan." His expression transformed, joy replacing the worry and exhaustion. "I love you too," he said fiercely. "I have loved you since the first morning I saw you checking those snares, trying so hard to take care of people who could not take care of themselves. Marry me, Genevieve. Let me take care of you the way you take care of everyone else." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, you ridiculous man. Yes." He kissed her then, and despite the cold and the snow and the watching world, Genevieve kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and hope and love she had been carrying. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, she realized her feet were numb from standing in the snow. Xander noticed at the same time and scooped her up, carrying her back to her cabin while she protested and laughed. The wedding was held in February, in the small church at the center of Trinity. Genevieve wore a dress that Martha had helped her make from fabric Xander had bought, cream-colored calico with lace at the collar and cuffs. Xander wore his best clothes, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion, his hands shaking slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Harold and Martha stood as witnesses, both of them beaming, and the small congregation of Trinity residents who had gathered to watch cheered when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. They moved into a cabin on the ranch property, a sturdy structure with a good fireplace and windows that did not let in the wind. It was larger than Genevieve's old place, with room for a real bed and a table and chairs and all the small comforts she had done without for so long. Xander carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the middle of their new home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, and Genevieve felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. The Pattersons remained in their cabin in town, but Xander and Genevieve visited them every week, always bringing supplies and often staying for supper. Genevieve continued to check her snares, now more for the pleasure of it than out of necessity, and she taught Xander the art of setting them properly. He was a patient student, and they spent many early mornings together walking the creek, working in comfortable silence or easy conversation. As spring came to Trinity, bringing warmth and new growth, Genevieve discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mix of joy and fear. She had lost so much in her life, had been disappointed so many times. But when she told Xander and saw the wonder and happiness in his face, some of the fear eased. This was different. He was different. They would face whatever came together. The pregnancy was not easy. Genevieve was sick for months, barely able to keep food down, exhausted to the point where even simple tasks felt overwhelming. Xander was patient and attentive, taking over the cooking and cleaning, rubbing her back when she was ill, holding her when she cried from frustration and discomfort. Martha visited often, bringing advice and remedies, her presence a comfort in itself. In November, almost exactly a year after Genevieve and Xander had first declared their feelings by the Pattersons' fire, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Genevieve was certain she would not survive it. But Martha was there, coaching her through each contraction, and when the baby finally came, red-faced and wailing, Genevieve felt a surge of love so intense it was almost painful. "A son," Xander said, his voice choked with emotion as he held the tiny bundle. "We have a son, Genevieve." They named him Thomas Harold Sullivan, honoring both Genevieve's first husband and the old man who had become like a grandfather to them both. Harold Patterson wept when they told him, and Martha fussed over the baby with the dedication of a woman who had never had children of her own, but possessed an endless capacity for love. The years that followed were not without their challenges. There were harsh winters and dry summers, times when money was tight and the future uncertain. Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years after Thomas was born, and they all mourned him deeply. Martha lived another 5 years, long enough to see the birth of Genevieve and Xander's second child, a daughter they named Grace Martha Sullivan. When Martha finally followed her husband, Genevieve and Xander buried her next to Harold in the Trinity Cemetery and wept for the loss of the woman who had been mother and grandmother and friend. But there were joys too, bright moments that outshone the difficulties. Thomas growing from a squalling infant into a curious, energetic boy who followed his father everywhere and asked endless questions. Grace, who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn determination, learning to walk and then to run, her laughter filling their home. The ranch prospered under Xander's hard work and dedication, and eventually he was made foreman, with a salary that allowed them to save and plan for the future. Genevieve still set snares sometimes, though now it was to teach Thomas the skill, passing on the knowledge her own father had given her. She watched her son learn to position the wire, to read the signs of the land, and felt the circle of time and tradition complete itself. Xander still hunted, bringing home deer and turkey, and once, memorably, a wild hog that had taken 3 days to track. He taught Thomas to shoot, to ride, to treat animals and land and people with respect. On their 10th anniversary, Xander took Genevieve back to the creek where he had first offered to bring venison for her and the Pattersons. It was early morning, the same time of day when she used to check her snares, and the light had that same amber quality she remembered from those desperate days when she had been alone and struggling. "You remember the first time we really talked?" Xander asked, his arm around her waist as they stood by the water. "Right here, when I offered to help and you nearly bit my head off for suggesting you needed charity," Genevieve laughed, leaning into his warmth. "I remember being terrified that you would see how desperate I was." "I had so much pride back then, so much fear." "You had courage," Xander corrected. "You were taking care of yourself and 2 elderly people with nothing but wire, snares, and determination. That is not something to be ashamed of." "I had help," Genevieve said softly. "A cowboy who brought venison for all 3 of us, who saw past my pride to the person underneath, who gave me a reason to hope again." Xander kissed the top of her head. "You gave me a home, Genevieve, a place to belong, a reason to stop drifting and start building." "I would say we helped each other." They stood there for a long time, watching the water flow, listening to the birds wake and begin their morning songs. Genevieve thought about the girl she had been, frightened and alone, setting snares at dawn with shaking hands and a desperate heart. She thought about Martha and Harold, the kindness they had shown her, the family they had become. She thought about Thomas and Grace, sleeping peacefully in their beds, safe and loved and full of promise. And she thought about Xander, the man who had brought more than venison to her life. He had brought laughter and partnership, steady love and quiet strength. He had shown her that starting over did not mean forgetting, that loving again did not diminish what had come before. He had made Trinity, Texas, feel like home in a way nowhere else ever had. "Thank you," she said finally, turning in his arms to face him. "For everything. For seeing me, for loving me, for building this life with me." Xander smiled, that same warm, transforming smile that had first broken through his hard exterior all those years ago. "Thank you for saying yes," he replied. "For taking a chance on a drifting cowboy with more shadows than prospects, for making me the happiest man in Texas." They walked back to their cabin hand in hand as the sun climbed higher, ready to wake their children and start another day. Behind them, the creek flowed on, marking the place where desperation had met generosity, where loneliness had found connection, where 2 damaged people had discovered they could still build something beautiful together. The years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. Thomas grew into a fine young man, strong and capable, with his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick mind. He learned ranching from Xander, but Genevieve also taught him to read and write, to appreciate books and learning. When he was 18, he announced his intention to study agriculture at the new college opening in Austin, wanting to bring modern farming techniques back to help the ranch and the community. Genevieve had cried with pride when he left, though she missed him terribly. Grace proved to have a talent for medicine, learning everything she could from the doctor who finally settled in Trinity when she was 12. By 16, she was assisting with births and illnesses, her steady hands and calm demeanor making her invaluable to the community. She spoke of becoming a real nurse, maybe even a doctor if she could find a school that would accept a woman. Xander encouraged her dreams even as he worried about the challenges she would face. A third child, another son named Samuel, arrived when Genevieve was 33, a surprise that had her and Xander both laughing at the unexpected blessing. Samuel was different from his older siblings, more bookish and thoughtful, content to spend hours drawing or reading while Thomas and Grace were always in motion. Genevieve saw pieces of herself in him, the girl who had loved teaching and learning before life had derailed those dreams. The ranch continued to prosper, and eventually Xander was offered the opportunity to buy it from the aging owner. It took years of saving and planning, but when Genevieve was 35 and Xander was 41, they signed the papers that made the Sullivan Ranch officially theirs. It was a moment of triumph, the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice and stubborn determination to build something lasting. On the evening after they took ownership, Genevieve stood on the porch of their home, looking out over land that was now truly theirs. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and she could hear Xander inside talking with Samuel about the day's work. Grace was in town helping the doctor with a difficult case, and Thomas had sent a letter from college full of enthusiasm about his studies and the new techniques he was learning. Genevieve thought about the path that had brought her here, all the twists and turns, the losses and gains. She thought about her parents, dead so many years now but still alive in her memories. She thought about Thomas Norwood, the husband she had barely known, whose death had paradoxically given her the freedom to find real love. She thought about Martha and Harold Patterson, the elderly couple who had saved her life with their kindness and who had received venison and care in return. But mostly she thought about Xander, about the morning he had appeared by the creek and offered to help a struggling woman he barely knew. About how one act of generosity had grown into friendship, then love, then a marriage that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. About how he still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world, even after years of marriage and children and the inevitable wearing down of time. "What are you thinking about?" Xander's voice came from behind her, and she felt his arm slide around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Everything," Genevieve said honestly. "All of it. Where we started and where we are now, how impossibly lucky I am." "We are lucky," Xander corrected. "Both of us. We found each other when we both needed finding. We built this together, Genevieve. Every bit of it." She turned in his arms, looking up at his face. He was older now, lines around his eyes and silver threading through his dark hair, but he was still the man who had offered venison to a proud, desperate woman and her elderly neighbors. Still the man who had seen past her walls to the person underneath. Still the man who made her heart race even after all these years. "I love you," she said, as she had said countless times before and would say countless times again. "More than I can ever properly express." "I know," Xander said, smiling, "because I feel the same way. And we have the rest of our lives to keep trying to find the words." They stood there together as the sun completed its descent and the first stars began to appear. Inside, Samuel called for his mother, needing help with something, and Genevieve reluctantly pulled away from Xander's embrace to attend to their son. But as she moved through her home, helping Samuel with his arithmetic, beginning preparations for supper, she carried the warmth of Xander's love with her like a light against the darkness. The seasons turned, as they always did. Spring gave way to summer, summer to fall, fall to the winter that had once seemed so threatening but now was just another phase of the year to be weathered and appreciated. Trinity grew from a collection of scattered buildings into a proper town, with a bank and a school and a railroad depot. Genevieve watched the changes with interest, pleased to see the community developing even as she cherished the memories of its rougher, simpler days. Thomas returned from college full of ideas and energy, immediately implementing new techniques on the ranch. He courted and married a girl from a neighboring ranch, a sweet-natured young woman named Elizabeth who fit into the Sullivan family, as if she had always been there. Their first child, a daughter they named Martha in honor of the woman who had meant so much to Genevieve, arrived less than a year after the wedding. Grace eventually left Trinity to study nursing in Houston, writing long letters home about her experiences and the fascinating medical cases she encountered. She came home for visits when she could, always bringing new knowledge and stories that kept the family entertained for hours. At 23, she met a doctor she admired, and after a year of courtship, married him in a ceremony at the Trinity Church where Genevieve and Xander had wed so many years before. Samuel proved to be artistically talented, his drawings and paintings capturing the beauty of the Texas landscape in ways that astonished everyone who saw them. He was quiet and somewhat solitary, but deeply loving to his family. At 19, he announced his intention to travel east to study art formally. And though it pained Genevieve to see another child leave, she supported his dreams as she had supported all her children. Through it all, Genevieve and Xander remained the constant center, the foundation upon which their family was built. They worked together running the ranch, made decisions together about their children, supported each other through every challenge and celebrated every triumph. They had disagreements, of course, moments of frustration or misunderstanding, but they had learned to talk through difficulties, to listen and compromise and remember what mattered most. On Genevieve's 45th birthday, Xander took her on a trip to San Antonio, their first real journey together since their wedding. They stayed in a hotel with a real feather bed and ate in restaurants with white tablecloths, and enjoyed the novelty of being just themselves, not parents or ranchers or community members, but simply Genevieve and Xander. They walked along the river, visited the Alamo, talked for hours about their lives and their children and their hopes for the future. "Do you ever regret it?" Genevieve asked one evening as they sat in a plaza, watching the world pass by. Tying yourself to a widow with nothing to her name, taking on the responsibility of her elderly neighbors, building a life in a dusty town in the middle of nowhere. Xander looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Regret marrying the love of my life. Regret the family we have built, the children we have raised, the home we have made. Genevieve, everything good in my life came from the day I decided to bring Venison to you and the Pattersons. Everything. But you could have had so much more," Genevieve persisted. "You could have traveled, seen the world, found someone younger or prettier or with more to offer." "I have everything I want," Xander said firmly, taking her hand. "You are everything I want, you and our children and the life we have built together. I would not change a single moment of it, not even the hard parts, because they all led us here. To this place, this moment, this life. I love you, Genevieve Sullivan. I loved you when you were a struggling widow setting snares at dawn, and I love you now as a successful rancher and mother and grandmother. I will love you when we are old and gray and can barely walk. There is no one else I would rather have spent my life with. No other path I wish I had taken." Genevieve felt tears slip down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in his words. After all these years, he could still move her to tears with his simple, honest declarations. "I love you too," she whispered. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. You gave me a life beyond anything I dreamed was possible." They returned to Trinity renewed and refreshed, ready to face whatever the future held. The ranch continued to thrive under their management and Thomas's innovative approaches. More grandchildren arrived, filling their lives with noise and chaos and joy. Grace's children, 2 boys and a girl, visited during summers and holidays. Samuel married a fellow artist and settled in New York, though he came home for visits and sent beautiful paintings that Genevieve hung with pride throughout their home. As Genevieve reached her 50th year, she found herself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought her to this place. She thought about the frightened, desperate 20-year-old who had set those first snares with shaking hands, hoping against hope that she could catch something to feed her neighbors. She thought about Martha and Harold, the kindness they had shown when she had nothing to offer in return. And she thought about Xander, always Xander, the cowboy who had brought venison for all 3 of them and changed her life forever. One morning, she returned to the creek behind where the Patterson cabin had once stood. The structure had been torn down years ago, too deteriorated to save, but the land remained. Genevieve walked to the spot where she used to set her snares, where Xander had first approached her with his offer of help. The creek still flowed, unchanged by the passage of time, and the mesquite still grew thick along its banks. She knelt down, touching the earth where she had once positioned wire loops with desperate precision. It seemed impossible that so much time had passed, that the struggling widow who had worked this ground was the same woman who now owned a successful ranch and had 3 grown children and several grandchildren. But the continuity was there, a straight line from that desperate dawn to this peaceful morning, and the connection was Xander. "I thought I might find you here," his voice came from behind her, and Genevieve looked up to see her husband approaching, moving a bit more carefully than he once had, his hair now more silver than dark. But his eyes were the same, warm and loving and full of understanding. "Just remembering," Genevieve said, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt, "thinking about how far we have come." "We have come far," Xander agreed, putting his arm around her shoulders, "but the journey was worth every step." They stood together by the creek, 2 people who had found each other in darkness and built a life in the light. Behind them stretched decades of memories, good and bad, joyful and painful, but all of them shared. Ahead lay whatever years remained, and neither of them knew how many that would be. But it did not matter, because they would face them together, as they had faced everything since that morning when a cowboy brought venison for a widow and her elderly neighbors. The years continued their inevitable march. Genevieve and Xander grew older. Their children grew into middle age, and their grandchildren began to have children of their own. The Sullivan Ranch passed to Thomas, who ran it with the same dedication his father had shown, implementing new techniques while maintaining the core values of hard work and integrity. Grace became renowned in medical circles for her work with maternal health, writing articles and teaching other nurses. Samuel's paintings hung in galleries across the country, and he sent money home to help support the family ranch and the town of Trinity. When Genevieve was 62 and Xander was 68, he had a heart attack while working on the ranch. Genevieve had been in the house when Thomas came running, his face white with panic, and she had felt her own heart stop in that moment. But Xander survived, though the doctor warned him to slow down, to take things easier. He grumbled about the restrictions but obeyed them, more for Genevieve's sake than his own. "I am not ready to leave you yet," he told her one night as they lay in bed, his hand clasped in hers. "I have too much left to do, too many sunsets to watch with you, too many grandchildren to spoil." "Then you had better take care of yourself," Genevieve said, her voice fierce with emotion, "because I am not ready to lose you either. I need you, Xander Sullivan. I need you for a good long while yet." He recovered slowly but steadily, and they adjusted their lives to accommodate his limitations. They spent more time on the porch, watching the ranch operate around them, enjoying the slower pace. They read together, talked for hours, received visits from their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It was a peaceful time, a time for reflection and gratitude. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were dozens of people, 3 generations of Sullivans and their spouses and children, filling the house and grounds with noise and laughter. A feast was prepared, stories were told, and Genevieve and Xander sat in chairs of honor, holding hands and watching their legacy unfold around them. Thomas stood to give a toast, his voice carrying over the assembled crowd. "My parents taught me many things," he said. "Hard work, integrity, the importance of family and community, but the most important thing they taught me was about love. Real love, the kind that lasts through hardship and joy, through sickness and health, through all the challenges that life throws at you. They showed me that love is not just a feeling but a choice, a commitment renewed every day. They showed me that true partnership means supporting each other's dreams, carrying each other through difficulties, and celebrating each other's triumphs. Everything I am, everything we all are as a family, comes from the foundation they built." To Genevieve and Xander Sullivan, the finest people I have ever known. The crowd raised their glasses, voices joining in the toast, and Genevieve felt tears streaming down her face. She looked at Xander and saw his eyes were wet too, both of them overwhelmed by the love surrounding them. This, she thought, this was the legacy that mattered. Not land or money or possessions, but the family they had created, the love they had nurtured, the values they had instilled. As the celebration continued around them, Xander leaned close and whispered in her ear. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day by the creek, when I offered to bring venison?" Genevieve thought back, smiling at the memory. "I said I did not need charity." "And you were right," Xander said. "What we built, what we have, it was never about charity. It was about 2 people helping each other, supporting each other, building something together that neither of us could have built alone. It was about seeing someone who needed help and offering it not out of pity but out of recognition. Because we were the same, you and I. Both lost, both struggling, both looking for a place to belong. And we found it," Genevieve said softly. "We found it together." "We did," Xander agreed. "We set snares at dawn and brought venison at dusk, and somehow, in the middle of all that surviving, we found a way to live, really live." They sat together as the party swirled around them. 2 old people who had loved each other for 50 years and would love each other until their last breath. The sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Genevieve thought about all the sunsets they had watched together, all the dawns they had greeted side by side. There would be more, she hoped many more. But if there were not, if this was the last one, or if tomorrow brought another or another 100, it did not change the essential truth. They had been blessed beyond measure. Xander lived another 8 years, long enough to see great-great-grandchildren, long enough to celebrate his 76th birthday surrounded by family. When he finally passed, it was peacefully in his sleep, Genevieve beside him as she had been for 58 years of marriage. She woke in the morning to find him gone, his hand still warm in hers, his face peaceful and serene. The grief was immense, a tidal wave that threatened to drown her. But Genevieve had survived loss before, and she knew she would survive this too, though the world felt dimmer without Xander in it. Her children gathered around her, their love and support carrying her through the darkest days. She told stories about their father, ensuring that the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had not known him well understood what an extraordinary man he had been. She lived another 6 years after Xander's death, years filled with family and memories and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. She watched more grandchildren marry, more great-grandchildren arrive. She saw the Sullivan Ranch continue to prosper under Thomas's management and eventually pass to his children. She saw Grace's medical work honored with awards and recognition. She saw Samuel's art celebrated in major exhibitions. And through it all, she carried Xander with her. Not as a weight or a burden, but as a presence, a companion of the heart. She spoke to him sometimes, sitting on the porch in the evening, telling him about the day's events, sharing thoughts and observations. She knew he could not answer, but it comforted her to imagine he was listening, that some part of him remained connected to her across the divide of death. When Genevieve died at the age of 84, it was surrounded by family, in the bed she had shared with Xander for so many years. Her children held her hands, her grandchildren gathered close, and as she slipped away, her last words were of love and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for all of it. Tell Xander I am coming. Tell him to wait for me." They buried her next to Xander in the Trinity Cemetery, in the plot they had chosen years before. The entire town came to the funeral, paying respects to a woman who had been teacher, rancher, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, friend, and pillar of the community. Stories were told about her generosity, her strength, her wisdom, her love. But the story that was told most often, the one that became part of Sullivan family legend, was about the morning a struggling widow set snares at dawn to catch food for her elderly neighbors, and how a cowboy brought venison for all 3 of them instead. It was a story about kindness meeting need, about 2 broken people finding wholeness in each other, about love that started with a simple act of generosity and grew into something that spanned decades and generations. The Sullivan Ranch continued for generations after Genevieve and Xander were gone, each new generation adding their own chapters to the story, while honoring the foundation laid by the couple who had started it all. The land that had once been wild prairie was now productive and prosperous, but the values that Genevieve and Xander had instilled remained constant: hard work, integrity, family, and the importance of helping others. In the town of Trinity, which had grown from a dusty collection of buildings into a thriving community, a memorial was eventually erected. It honored the early settlers who had built the town, and prominent among them were the names of Harold and Martha Patterson, who had shown kindness to a stranger in need, and Genevieve and Xander Sullivan, who had built a legacy of love and service that touched countless lives. The creek still flowed behind where the Patterson cabin had once stood, its waters carrying on their eternal journey. Rabbits still made their runs along its banks, though no wire snares awaited them now. Deer still moved through the mesquite thickets, though they were no longer hunted to feed desperate, hungry people. The land had changed, had been shaped by human hands and human hearts, but its essential nature remained. And if you listened carefully, on certain quiet mornings when the light had that particular amber quality, you might almost hear the echo of footsteps along the creek bank. A young woman checking her snares with desperate hope. A cowboy bringing venison for all 3 of them, an offering that would change everything. 2 people finding each other in the hardness of the Wild West and choosing, against all odds, to build something beautiful together. Their story became legend, passed down through generations of Sullivans and through the wider community of Trinity. It was a reminder that even in the hardest times, even when survival seems impossible, there is room for kindness, for love, for the human connections that make life worth living. It was a testament to the power of simple generosity, of seeing someone in need and choosing to help, not for recognition or reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do. And it was, above all, a love story. Not the kind found in fairy tales, with instant passion and effortless romance, but the real kind. The kind built on shared struggles and mutual respect, on choosing each other every day even when it was hard, on building a life together one decision, one moment, one act of love at a time. It was the story of Genevieve and Xander Sullivan, who proved that love could grow from the most unlikely beginnings and flourish beyond anything either of them had imagined possible. The sun rose and set over Trinity, Texas, as it had for countless years and would for countless more. Seasons changed, generations came and went, but the story endured. A woman set snares at dawn for the elderly couple next door. A cowboy brought venison for all three. And from that simple beginning, something extraordinary was born.